Whenever the next general election is, one of the biggest stories will be here in Scotland. If Labour want the keys to number 10, they will almost certainly need a revival in a nation they used to dominate. Tonight, we're in the market town of Kelso. In the Scottish borders, it claims to have the largest cobbled town square in all of Scotland. And from here, it's just a short drive or a bit of a long walk to the English border. And our audience here reflects the broad electoral picture across Scotland. Welcome to Question Time. From the Scottish Government, Angela Constance, Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs. That's mainly police, prisons and the courts, all of which are devolved to Scotland. She previously had stints as Minister for Drugs Policy and Education. Meghan Gallacher has been Deputy Leader of the Scottish Conservatives for nearly 18 months. The UK party may be in power at Westminster, but they are the second biggest party in the Holyrood Parliament, with around a quarter of the seats. Leading Scottish Labour is Anna Sarwar. The Glaswegian was a dentist until entering professional politics in 2010. Having dominated Scotland for much of the 20th century, his party is now third biggest at Holyrood, with just 2 Scottish MPs at Westminster, although the polls suggest a revival. Kate Andrews is economics editor and columnist at the right-leaning magazine The Spectator. Yesterday, she wrote of her fears that the UK economy is at a standstill or may even be going backwards. And in Stephen Noon's 20 years in politics, he was a senior advisor to First Minister Alex Salmond and then chief strategist behind the Scottish independence campaign. He then quit to do God's work, training to be a Jesuit priest. He's now left the Jesuits and is in academia. Welcome to our panel. Welcome to our audience here in Kelso. Great to see you. And of course, welcome to you at home. You can watch or listen to the programme on iPlayer or BBC Sounds and take part, of course, on social media. Get involved in the debate. Right, let's take our first question, which the panel do not know, from Maggie Mackenzie.
Given its different factions, for how much longer can the Conservatives remain as one credible, singular political party?
Well, Meghan, I'm going to come to you first. First of all, how many factions would you say there are? There's 5, there's 5 families, and then there's others. Look, can you count them all?
Look, I think I can certainly admit that it has been a difficult time for my party. However, I think it's clear that the Prime Minister is focused. He's got his 5 priorities, including reducing debt, having inflation, things that people really want the government
stopping the boats, which of course is
stopping the boats. Yes, which is another priority.
Enlightened us to all these factions.
Which is another priority that the Prime Minister is focusing on. So I think what the public are needing from a government just now is for them to get on with the day job, focusing on people's priorities, and that is exactly what the Prime Minister is doing at present.
And with all the different factions, has the Conservative Party effectively become ungovernable?
No. I mean, the Conservative Party is a broad church, and there will be times where there is disagreement over certain policies. However, what we can see and what we are seeing is the government getting on with the top 5 priorities that Rishi Sunak set out. So actually, I think that's what people want to see. They want to see a government that's getting on with the job. They want to see a government that's focused on the cost of living crisis, which Rishi Sunak is absolutely committed to focusing on. And that's exactly what we're getting on with.
Angela.
Well, of course, whatever faction in the Tory party you're making reference to, none of them speak to the priorities of the people of Scotland. We have seen most recently the autumn budget statement, which is the worst scenario for Scotland. They have prioritised tax cuts and bankers' bonuses as opposed to public services. We are now in the grips of austerity Mark II, austerity that is worse than that was ushered in by George Osborne. We have a cost of living crisis that sees food inflation at 10%, and yet the Conservative government had £27 billion headroom that it could have used to invest in the long term and to invest in public services. Instead, Rishi Sunak has pandered to various interests, various extreme interests within his own party. And I think the piece to the resistance in all of this is a government that is prepared to abandon our international obligations. It has an unhealthy focus on penalising refugees and asylum seekers, whereas we in Scotland face a population challenge where in the next 25 years, particularly marked for rural communities, we need to grow our working age population. So we should be focused on growing our economy.
I mean, Maggie's question is whether the splits of the Conservatives make it a credible political party. I mean, it's hardly been plain sailing for the SNP in recent times. I'm thinking about massive by-election defeat and, of course, a small matter of a police investigation.
Well, of course, I'm a lifelong Scottish nationalist. I've campaigned for Scottish independence since I was 18 years old because it is the one thing that is the route to addressing child poverty. It is the route to growing our economy. It is the route to making decisions on a par with any other normal country.
But in terms of the credibility of the party,
well,
which is what Maggie's talking about.
I mean, of course, the SNP has not had the easiest years, but I've been in the SNP for over 30 years, and I can tell you right now we've had tougher years when we had 3 MPs and we were at 12% of the vote. And what the Scottish Government and what the SNP is focused on right now is delivering for the people of Scotland and getting us out of this mess and getting us out of this failed Westminster economic model.
Man there in the tweed jacket.
You mentioned tax cuts in your dialogue there. I work for a company that's based in England, but I live in Scotland, work from home, and I'm paying higher taxes. So how does that work?
So for me, so while the Scottish Government has limited powers in taxation, we don't have the full range of taxation powers. I am pleased and proud of the fact that we have the most progressive income tax policy in Scotland. I myself earn a good wage and I'm perfectly happy to be paying more to be investing in public services.
And will people in Scotland be paying more tax? Because of course there's been talk today that the First Minister is going to introduce a new tax band.
Well, of course, Fiona,
is that going to happen?
With no disrespect to yourself, Fiona, but the Scottish Parliament is the place where the Scottish Government's budget will be laid. And if you'll forgive me, I'm not going to reveal the Scottish Government's...
Would you support it, though?
I am not going to be revealing the Scottish Government's budget here on the BBC.
But would you support it?
Well, what I've always supported is progressive taxation policies. We do, of course, have to bear in mind that when you don't have the full range of fiscal powers, you have to be very conscious of unintended consequences. But what I would say is that more people from the rest of the UK come to live and work and study in Scotland than people who leave Scotland to go elsewhere. And I think that puts paid to this notion that people leave in response to progressive tax policies.
Anas.
Look, we have Scotland is fueled by 2 bad governments, but the specific question was about the Conservatives. And I think if times weren't so serious, it would be quite funny, actually, seeing a Tory MP, Mark Francois, talk about the 5 families as if he was some kind of pretend mafia don, I think just makes the whole situation utterly pathetic. The reality is that Rishi Sunak is weak, the Conservatives are out of touch, they're corrupt, they're lying, they're divided, they're chaotic, they're out of ideas, and frankly, they're out of time as well. And what's going to happen in 2024 is the Conservatives are going to try and make you forget what has happened over the last 4 years since the last general election. And we've got to make sure nobody forgets. Nobody should forget Partygate. Nobody should forget the billions of pounds wasted in the PPE scandal. No one should forget Liz Truss crashing the economy, meaning mortgages going through the roof for families right across the country. Nobody should forget the culture wars and the fact that we've had 2 leadership elections, 3 prime ministers, 5 chancellors, all failing our country when all we need is 1 election so we can get rid of the whole rotten lot of them.
question is about the splits in the Conservative Party. I've already spoke to Angela about the SNP. In terms of Labour, of course, there are splits over Gaza. You've taken a different position to the Labour leader, Keir Starmer. He does not support a ceasefire. You do support a ceasefire. Well, look, there are splits there too.
Well, look, actually, Keir, what we're all united on is the fact that we want to see a peace process in the Middle East.
You do, but you're divided on how you want to get there.
And look, Keir is actually calling for a cessation of all hostilities, but I'm really, really clear that right now we have a tragic situation. The last 60-plus days, we've had 1,400 Israelis losing their life, and we've had 18,000 Palestinians losing their life. And one loss of life of one innocent individual is one too many. And that's why 4 things need to happen immediately. One is an immediate ceasefire. That means an end to rocket fire going into and out of Gaza. Second, immediate access to humanitarian aid, so people aren't literally starving and dying to death, dying because of starvation, or indeed dying because of a lack of basic medicines. We need to see the immediate release of hostages. There are still over 100 hostages in Gaza, and we have to see a pathway to a peace process. And just one final comment, Fiona. Anyone that saw the interview with the Israeli ambassador yesterday can see quite clearly now that, of course, we have to separate Hamas from the Palestinian people, because Hamas has no interest in peace and is a divisive organisation that unleashed hell on the people of Israel. But we should be really clear that we have to separate Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right government from the Israeli people, who have no interest in peace either. Until we
the
change
reason I raised it is simply because of the difference in your approach to that of the party leader. And we're talking about Maggie's questions about splits within the Conservative Party. I'm just talking about the other parties too. Man there in the glasses.
My instinct was to vote Conservative, and I voted Conservative in the last election, but I'm actually now quite embarrassed about it because of the behaviour of that party. And
so
today,
what in particular embarrasses you?
Well, it's the whole carry on, you know, the infighting, you know, Liz Truss, you know, it's just absolute joke now. They need to move on. Now, my instinct as well is to be a unionist. I voted to stay in the European Union. I voted to stay in the UK Union. And I would like to vote for Labour here in the next election, but I feel like my vote will be wasted because of the electoral system that we have in the UK. So I just don't know what to do with my vote, actually.
OK, all right. Well, let's see. I'll come back to you at the end of the programme, and let's see if anything you hear tonight gives you a clear idea of who you want to vote for. Right, I'm going to make a note of that. What's your name?
It's Jim.
Jim. OK, Jim. Let's see what you think by
Just
the end.
added Jim to our target voter pool.
Exactly, exactly. Now, there's a man here in a shirt with Christmas elves on, so I've definitely got to hear from you. What would you like to say?
Going back to the original question about, you know, the fragmentation within the parties, I think it's a lot to do with our broken politics. And mentioning what the other gentleman's just said, in Scotland we've got proportional representation, and for me, if Labour put proportional representation in their manifesto, I would really consider actually voting for them. But at this moment in time, I wouldn't. And I think that's the big change that UK politics has to go through.
All right. So, Stephen, let me come to you and let me remind you of the question.
Yeah.
Given its different factions, for how much longer can the Conservatives remain as one credible, singular political party?
So I think this is the key point. I think proportional representation is the key point. So I think it is good for the Conservative Party, because I think the Conservative Party, to be its authentic self, needs to actually break away from the extreme. So there's a group on the extreme of the Conservative Party that's been drawing them rightwards, and that's not good for the Conservative Party or for the country. So PR exactly would allow that rump to exist on itself.
And by that rump, you're talking about what, Suella Braverman? Is
The sort of European Reform Group, whatever you call it, the UKIP Reform...
European Research Group.
European Research Group. So that sort of right-wing, isolationist, extreme section of the Conservative Party. So, look, thinking about the budget, there were some really excellent things in the autumn statement recently. So, for example, the reforms of pensions. I think that was a really sensible measure, and it represented, you know, maybe the Conservative Party at its best. The Conservative Party in terms of the brand we might expect of it, which is interested in wealth creation, interested in business, interested in things like sensible reforms in the financial sector. But what we're getting from the Conservative Party is Brexit, you know, madness on immigration, which is not good for the economy, And the Conservative Party has been pulled further and further and further to the right. So PR is the answer, but also I think the Labour Party's got responsibility as well to reach out across the divide. So Rishi Sunak's having to make deals on the right. He could also make deals in the centre. He could speak to the Liberal Democrats, the SNP, the Labour Party, about working out an immigration policy that makes sense, rather than one that panders to the extremes.
Kate.
Very quickly want to address the question on tax before I get to factions, because whilst the state of public finances in Whitehall is pretty abysmal, Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt worked hard to actually deliver meaningful tax cuts for both business and for workers. And if you compare that to what is expected to happen in your upcoming budget, and it is speculated, but it is thought we're actually going to see tax hikes, I think there's a clear distinction between those two things. You can complain about tax cuts, but let's see where people actually fall, whether they'd like to receive a tax cut or a tax hike.
It's still the biggest tax burden for many decades.
We're approaching a post-war high, but I'm delighted that tax cuts are back in the narrative. On the factions, I think we learned two things this week. We realized that the Tories, despite making some very loud noises and being very disappointed about the polls and where their party is at, I think we realized that at the moment, they still think Rishi Sunak is the right person to take them into the next election. Because if they didn't, I think we would have seen something much more radical happen around that vote on the Rwanda bill in its second reading. Despite all these factions, we learned something else as well. We've got a faction that wants to relive the Brexit days. We've got a faction focused on more northern investment. We've got a faction trying to revive the Trussonomics era. They claim to be very different, but they've all, broadly speaking, accepted, albeit they want tweaks, a cruel gimmick designed under Boris Johnson to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda and never let them have a chance to have a pathway to stay in the UK. And that cruel gimmick has become a central part, the centerpiece, if you will, of Tory public policy and what they plan to run the next election on. And I think it is truly baffling, and I don't think it's right-wing, frankly, because the best of the right, to your point, embraces the individual, understands difficult circumstances, and wants to help those most in need. You don't come up with gimmicks that are going to put, at most, several hundred people on a flight at the cost of £170,000 per person taxpayer money, and send them off to Rwanda as some kind of solution to your broken asylum policy. So I think we learned those two things this week, and I got to tell you, certainly on the second one, I'm incredibly disappointed.
Okay. Right. I'm going to move on and take another question. Before I do, I just want to say that this is our last programme before Christmas, but we are already planning next year's programmes, of course, and our first one of the new year is in Oxford on January the 11th. So if you'd like to be in the audience, go to the Question Time website, follow the instructions, and hopefully we will see you in Oxford, January the 11th. Our next question then, from Henry Bateson.
As the Scottish National Party's support dwindles and the polls suggest Labour filling the void, is independence now a pipe dream?
Well, obviously I'm going to ask you first, Angela.
Well, thank you very much for that, Fiona, and thank you to the gentleman for the question. Independence is not a pipe dream. Independence for the future of our country remains a popular option, and in terms of recent polls, it's either narrowly ahead or narrowly behind. And the focus in terms of the Scottish National Party is on transformational change. The current Westminster Field economic model is crippling our country. We have always pushed the powers of devolution to the max to do as much as we can with the resources and talents that we have in this country.
Let's not ignore the first part of Henry's point, which is as the Scottish National Party support dwindles and polls suggest Labour is filling the void. What's your response to that?
Well, in terms of being specific about Labour, my question would be...
Well, and your support dwindling?
Well, I will come to that point, because I would dispute that point, bearing in mind that the Scottish National Party is the only party that will campaign head, heart and soul for the independence of this country. And the question for the Labour Party is that will they respect this country's right to choose? And irrespective of what you view the future of the constitution of this country, most people in this country believe that the people of Scotland have the right to choose our constitutional future. Will the Labour Party respect that? Will the Labour Party take us back into the European Union, which Scots are the only country to be dragged out of the European Union against our will? Will Labour take us back into the European Union? No.
Okay, well, let's talk about the SNP just for a minute.
Silence.
Angela, since also you are here representing the SNP. So what, if Henry's question about is independence a pipe dream, what is the SNP's policy on achieving independence?
Well, the SNP's policy on achieving independence is to campaign for it, to put it front and centre of the next general election.
But in terms of, because obviously we had Nicola Sturgeon, who was going to call a de facto referendum at the next general election. That has now gone as a strategy. So what is the strategy now, other than campaigning for it and trying to persuade people that independence is the best route for Scotland? What is the strategy to actually achieve it?
So our strategy, to answer the gentleman's question, is support for the SNP remains high. In fact, the last poll that I actually seen, it had the SNP ahead of Labour in both the Scottish Parliament and the Westminster election.
I mean, the by-election was clearly not a great result for the SNP, was it?
I appreciate that. But I do also recognise that there's only one poll that counts when it comes to either a Scottish Parliament election or indeed a general election. But
well, just in terms of just to come back to the strategy a minute, because as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Humza Yousaf...
Did you not watch our conference, Fiona?
I've watched a lot of it, yes, since you asked. Thank you very much. It was absolutely riveting, particularly you. Humza Yousaf proposes the Scottish Government should seek talks with the UK Government on independence. So we've got the Conservatives here, we've got Labour, who hope to be the next government. So how are you going to persuade them?
Well, my question...
I mean, they're just here, so what
my question to both the Labour colleagues and our Conservative colleagues is, are they going to respect democracy in this country, bearing in mind the Scottish National Party has a mandate for a referendum and has secured its successive elections, national elections in Scotland. We have secured that mandate. And the question is indeed for the Unionist parties to
but
say...
you've got to persuade them. I'm just wondering how you're going to do it, because so far it hasn't worked.
But the question for the Unionist parties is, will they respect democracy in this country? Will they respect the right of the people of Scotland to determine their own future, or are they going to continue to be democracy deniers?
OK, I mean, the polls at the moment, as you say, suggest it's pretty much 50-50 in terms of independence. So is that enough to persuade them, do you think?
Well, the point of the general election is to ensure that we galvanise every activist for independence, that we, front and centre of that campaign for independence, have the courage of our convictions, and to convince the people of Scotland that if you want to escape from a failed Westminster economic model, if you want to escape from a cost of living crisis, if you truly want transformational change in terms of our economy, in terms of growing our population, and recognising that independence is the only possible route back into the EU, independence is the only choice that will secure the economic future of this country.
Stephen, is independence now a pipe dream?
So no, I mean, independence is not a pipe dream. I think where you're right, Henry, is I think the political energy has shifted. I think we've ended a period of 10 years where the central energy in Scottish politics was the referendum and the aftermath of the referendum. And I think the energy is now shifting to the likelihood of a Labour government in the UK, a Labour government that's talking about constitutional reform, which will include some change for Scotland. It's for me, the energy behind those who believe in a stronger Scottish Parliament has to now be persuading Labour to make the offer in the Scottish Parliament as strong as possible.
So increased devolution.
So
what Angela's suggesting, which is go for independence as soon as possible. Quite how you achieve it is a different matter. So that's not the way forward.
So I think there's good, there's better, and there's best. I think independence is best. I think a Labour government elected at Westminster is good. But the problem with a Labour government elected at the next election is it's there for maybe 5 years. It protects us for 5 years. What actually protects us in the long term is having powers transferred to the Scottish Parliament so we can make the decisions ourselves. So that's the better option, a stronger Parliament, home rule, as you might want to call it. But the best option absolutely is independence. So I believe that Scotland will become an independent country. But I think we need to become independent well. So we need to take it slowly. I think we need to do it in steps. So one of the lessons of Brexit is that if you leave the union in conflict with your neighbour, if you leave it with no plan in place, you end up with a bad result. So I want independence to happen in a way that is unifying in Scotland. We do it in cooperation with the rest of the UK because they're our closest partners, friends, neighbours. But we also do it in a way where we have the institutional capacity, we have the ability to become independent in a secure, smooth and successful way. Because the success of independence will be determined about how we become independent as much as anything else.
So you're talking about some time off by the sound of it.
So it may take 10 years, it may take 15 years, it may take 20 years. But we become stronger, we take on more powers, we work out what we need, what levers we need in Scotland in order to deal with the pressing problems in Scotland. But we also reflect on the relationships we need. So I think we need more independence, but we also need to have ongoing relationship with the rest of the UK and a renewed relationship with the European Union. And that's a fine balance, and it's not just going to happen if we click our fingers. We have to work towards it. Okay. I think, we have to take it slightly more slowly than the SNP is maybe arguing for publicly at the moment.
Which is interesting, given that you were the chief strategist for the Yes Independence campaign. But this is where this is the point you've reached now.
I still believe passionately in independence, but I want us to become independent in the best possible way.
Well, let's look. There's quite a few hands up. Let's hear from someone. The woman at the back.
I thought we had a vote not that long ago for independence.
And you were happy with the outcome, I'm assuming, from the way you said that?
Well, I actually voted SNP, but I'm so glad I was in the minority.
Would you just want to expand on that a bit?
Well, I voted for independence, but I'm glad I was in the minority.
Right, because you think that would have been the wrong decision?
Correct.
And so why are you thinking that now?
I just think the country's in such a mess, and we do need a new government, absolutely.
Right, so you voted SNP, but you wouldn't vote SNP now?
No.
OK. The man next to you.
How independent would Scotland be if we've got the Germans and the French telling us what to do when we get this independence?
Do you mean if you rejoin the EU?
We're not going to...
What do you mean? Do you mean if you rejoin the EU?
If we got independence and we rejoined the EU, then what independence do we have? At least with the UK government, we have influence, we have MPs there, and we can do something with it. We will have no say. We will be a nation of 5 million people at the very end of Europe that no one or very few will listen to in Brussels.
OK. And the woman there, in the multicoloured sweater, I think, yes.
The SNP is too Central Belt focused. It doesn't pay enough attention to what people in this part of the world and in the north of Scotland need. And until then, I don't believe borderers or people in the north will focus on independence.
I think it's important to look at the context. We've had the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election, our first parliamentary by-election win in 12 years in Scotland, where we got more than double the SNP vote. And opinion polls had the first time in the lead from the SNP, the first time in over a decade. And also important to note that when I became leader, we were at 14% in the opinion polls, 32 points behind the SNP, never mind ahead of them. And the reason why that's happened is because Scottish Labour under my leadership is not going to turn our back to any voter, regardless of how they voted in the 2014 independence referendum. And we are the only political party in Scotland actually trying to persuade anybody and trying to bring our country back together and unified around change and owning change. Because one thing I'm really clear about is there is no overwhelming majority or consistent majority for independence in this country. There isn't a consistent majority for a referendum right now in this country, but neither is there a majority in this country for the status quo. But there is an overwhelming majority in Scotland for change. And the first opportunity for that change comes in the general election in 2024 and then the Scottish Parliament election in 2026. So I say openly to people, I don't support independence, I don't support a referendum, but I recognise we need change right now. And we may ultimately disagree on the final destination for Scotland, but we can all go on this part of the journey of change together. That means getting rid of a rotten Tory government across the UK come the general election, but it also means in 2026, come that Scottish Parliament election, we can have a competent government here in Scotland as well. Because some people might point to the independence question, and that's the reason why the SNP is losing support. The ultimate reason why the SNP is losing support is because incompetence has consequences. Over 800,000 of our fellow Scots are on an NHS waiting list. The PISA scores last week shows that our education system, once regarded as the best in the world, is declining under the SNP, and we can't even build ferries anymore in the country, where we're £250 million over budget. And that's why change is coming in the form of the Scottish Labour Party.
There's a person there with, all I can see is a green sleeve. Oh, yes, it's a woman there, yeah.
Hi. I'm just referring back to the gentleman up there. I feel that the English government does not listen to the Scots, that they just don't seem to want to talk.
Can I just say on that one? I think we just need to be really careful, because I know you're not doing that, but I know sometimes our political opponents do it, where they try and conflate Westminster to people everywhere across the country. The problem is not just Westminster or England. The problem is this rotten Tory government, where people in England agree with us that they're a rotten Tory government. So let's get rid of them and have a government that works for every part of the country, including for Scotland.
Kate.
I think it's clear that the SNP are struggling with the same issues that the Tories are, which is if you've been in power for more than a decade, well more than a decade, you cannot point the finger of blame at anybody else, and you cannot really distract with much, because all of the public policy failings, even if you're not responsible for all of them, are on you. You know, there's plenty that Rishi Sunak has inherited, but he has to take responsibility for it. In the case of the SNP, I think Anna's laid out a lot of important points there. Life expectancy in Scotland has plummeted since recently. It's the sharpest fall in 40 years under the SNP. The drugs deaths are the highest in Europe. You can talk about independence, and it's an important question. It's not for me to answer. That is for you to answer. But ultimately, what people want solved tomorrow are these crucial issues that affect their daily lives. And I think what's affecting the Tories absolutely is affecting the SNP as well. You cannot distract. You cannot point the blame elsewhere. You have to take responsibility. And when you try to cover it up, and certainly when you say, oh, it's not really like that, you know, things are better than it seems, it's never better than it seems. People understand what's going on in the real economy and in their real lives, and it's understandable that they want to see change.
When I'm out on the doorsteps, you know, speaking to voters, it's not independence that is the automatic big issue that people are wanting to speak to you about. It's things like our NHS waiting times. It's about getting to see a GP. It's about our potholes. It's about our school standards. It's about making sure that we've got police officers in the heart of our communities. These are the issues that people want to see a government focused on. But as we've just heard from Angela, our party political broadcast about independence, that really does not resonate with what people are wanting the Scottish Government to focus on right now. And I'm sorry, going back to the tax issue, Scotland is the highest taxed part of the United Kingdom, and people are not getting bang for their buck, because if they did, we wouldn't have high NHS waiting lists, we wouldn't have our school standards slipping, and we'd have more police officers on our streets keeping people safe. So I think Angela really needs to answer the questions of our government. Why are you not focused on people's priorities?
Angela, I'm going to absolutely let you do that. Let me just, Henry's had his hand up and he asked the question, so let's hear from you, Henry, then I'll let Angela reply.
I'm going to try and answer my own question here. Is the SNP support dwindling? I think that's pretty obvious. Is it a pipe dream? At the moment, yes, a big yes. What I'm a bit worried about in terms of if Scotland were to leave the UK, what currency would you use? Would you adopt the euro? Would you have your own currency? Or would you have the sterling like you've got now? If you have the sterling, you've got no control over your monetary policy. The Eurozone, you need to have a budget deficit of no more than 3% of your GDP. At the moment, it was about 10%. It was 22% during the pandemic. All these things are really intricate and hard. And I just wondered, how on earth are you going to be able to do this economically?
Well, that's a really big question and lots of things for you to answer, and also lots of points made here. So reasonably brief, if you would, Angela, if I can ask you fairly, because what you've not only heard from Henry, but also a lot of people saying when it comes to basic things we want sorted out, the SNP is failing.
The economic consequences of Brexit is here and now. And here and now, Our economy has shrunk, across the UK, by the way, between 2.5% and 5%. That has taken billions of pounds out of the economy across the UK. So there is a conspiracy of silence here where neither the Labour Party or the Tory Party... Please let me finish. I'm going to get to our record. I'm going to get to our record. But there's a conspiracy of silence amongst the Conservatives and the Labour Party. They don't want to talk about the cost of Brexit, the economic cost of Brexit, because neither of those parties will respect the democratic will of Scotland to take us back into Europe, or indeed the fact that most people across the UK, according to polls, if you believe polls, now think it was a mistake to leave Brexit. And in terms of what we are doing right here, right now in Scotland, the Scottish Child Payment is now lifting 90,000 children out of poverty, and I am happy to pay more tax to lift children out of poverty. But devolution has its limits. And please, ladies and gentlemen, make no mistake about it. If you think austerity under George Osborne was hard, you ain't seen nothing yet, because there is a failed economic model that we are tied to through the Westminster government. And in terms of those normal powers of independence, the point of independence is to make different choices so that we give all of our children more choices, more chances, and we make decisions about our relationships, yes, with our nearest friends and neighbours south of the border, but also with our friends and neighbours across Europe, because the UK government has imposed boundaries and barriers to this country reaching its true potential.
So, Angela, thank you. I'm going to come on to another question, which a number of people have touched on, so let's deal with it head on, from Paul Copson.
Scottish schools are no longer top of the class, and according to last week, are in steep decline. What can be done to reverse the current trend?
Anas, let's kick off with you.
Well, I think, first of all, in answer to that question, but also following up from what Angela said, is for how long are we going to blame somebody else in this country? That's all the SNP seem to do. They've been in full control of our education system for 16 years, but want to blame somebody else. They've been in full control of our National Health Service for 16 years, and we've got record high waiting times. They've been in control of our housing.
OK, but Anas, let's stick to the question, which is about education.
30,000 families are homeless right now in Scotland.
Let's stick to the question about education.
Specifically on education, one, the government's taken its eye off the ball. It should never have withdrawn us from the other international league tables, so we couldn't measure ourselves against excellence in other countries. That was an absolute mistake. And the reason why they did it is because they didn't want to be held to account. Right now, we have got to make sure that we are fixing our education system. That means appropriate numbers of teachers. It means appropriate numbers of support staff. For example, assisted support needs teachers in our schools. You have seen the number of children that require additional support needs almost quadruple in our country, but you've seen the number of ASN teachers fall by 200 under the SNP's watch. They're not properly resourced local government. That means less resources in our classrooms, and they have not linked skills, the economy and our education system together, meaning we have lagging growth compared to other parts of the United Kingdom.
So where are you going to find the money for that, Anas?
So first and foremost, we have to get growth back into our economy. Because
but that's going to take quite some time.
No, and I accept that.
So what will happen? Should people, if Labour gets in at the next general election, should people just expect that for the first 3 or 4 years, nothing's really going to change?
I think we should be upfront and straightforward with people right across the country, and not make promises we can't keep, and recognise that it is going to take time to fix the mess that's been left for us by the Conservatives across the UK and by the SNP here in Scotland. And so, therefore, growing the economy has to be front and centre, because unless you can increase the size of the cake, unless you can get more money coming into the coffers, you aren't able to invest in reforming our services right across the country. And once we do get that growth, we have to make sure that growth is shared fairly right across every part of the country and used to reform our public services. But the SNP can't hide from their responsibility about delivering growth in here in Scotland as well.
Stephen. Let me remind you of the question. Scottish schools are no longer top of the class. According to last week's... Incidentally, for those of you not aware, this is a reference to the latest PISA report, which is an international study of 15-year-olds and has been going for many, many years, and it revealed a long-term decline in Scotland's performance when it came to reading, maths and science. over some significant period. What can be done to reverse the current trend?
So one of my fundamental criticisms of politics in Scotland at the moment is that too often politicians offer simplistic solutions to quite complex problems, and there's a lot of finger pointing. So I would say that the problem in Scottish education is a responsibility of all of us. I think there's obviously a responsibility which is the Scottish Government. They've got a policy, the Parliament is a policy responsibility. Education, if you look at the COSLA, the local government website, education is largely a local government responsibility. That's not to point the finger at them, but it's to say there's a role for councils as well. There's a role for teachers, but there's also a role for parents and for those of us who support kids. So I think we've got to see the educational success of young Scots as being a collective responsibility.
But that's true across the entire United Kingdom.
Absolutely.
But when you come and look at the PISA report, Scotland is doing particularly badly compared to England.
I mean, what I would say is, well, we made a choice in Scotland. So in England, we made the choice to teach to test. So you go into an English classroom and you'll see somebody teaching to the test. In Scotland, we made a choice to teach to learn or to teach to think. And I think that's the better choice. We can debate whether the implementation of it has been correct, but for me, that's a better way of preparing kids for the complexities of the modern world.
OK. Man there in the glasses.
There's a huge disconnect between what goes on in the government making the decisions and what actually goes on in the schools. My wife worked in early years education for many years. She loved nothing more than preparing our youngest people for that transition into primary education. And it's what got her out of bed every morning for it. But people in government decided to bring in new policies and new legislations and new ways of doing things.
Are you talking about the National Curriculum for Excellence? Is that what you're referring to?
No, this is even below that.
Right, OK.
With nursery children. And it's some of the ridiculous things that what they did was they said, right, we're going to take out nursery teachers. We will no longer have nursery teachers, but we will have early years practitioners. We're not going to pay them as much, but we're going to get them to do what nursery teachers were doing. And all of a sudden, a huge load was put on these people having to keep records of attainment for these young people. And they weren't being able to actually spend the time with them to nurture them because they're too busy doing observations. Can they draw a line? Can they colour in between the lines? Can they do this? Can they do that? And if I can...
So it took the wrong approach, is what you're saying, in the early years?
They took the wrong approach, and what they need to do is to actually get out there, see what goes on in schools, and make plans from there.
Okay. Man at the back in the blue sweater.
To a degree, what Mr. Sarwar was saying is correct in the fact that we've lost a number of ASN teachers, etc., etc. Local government has been underfunded for a number of years. I myself used to work in adult literacy and was made redundant from the local authority 4.5 years ago. So local authorities have had the funding cut tremendously over the last few years. But the biggest driver for lack of educational attainment is poverty. It's recognised that poverty is a major driver for lack of educational attainment. And to go back to what Kate said earlier about people life expectancy declining, there's 300,000, according to the University of Glasgow, there's over 300,000 excess deaths directly due to the Conservative governments between 2013 and 2019. And that's one of the reasons we've got the excessive deaths. That's one of the reasons, not all, that we've got low education achievement.
And I think what you're referring to is because of NHS waiting lists and backlogs and that kind of... Is that what you're talking about?
It's due to Conservative Party policy. It's research done by the University of Glasgow. I think they come down at 335,000 excess deaths.
OK, all right, I have to say I'm not familiar with that research. Kate, in terms of the question, what can be done to reverse the current trend?
Well, look, I agree that we need to grow the economy, but I do not think this is so simple as to say that we simply need to pump more money into these services. School spending per pupil is 18% higher in Scotland than it is in England. That amounts to over £1,000 per pupil. And yet, according to these new PISA results, students in Scotland have fallen almost a year behind their English counterparts. It isn't so simple as to say we just need more money. We have to look at the curriculum. And it appears that the curriculum for excellence is simply not. You know, it's a lovely phrase, teach to think.
Not everyone south of the border will be familiar with the national curriculum.
Sure, but these changes...
So should we just say, it's basically, it's reducing, tell me if you don't agree with this, Angela, it's reducing prescribed content and it's more an additional focus on life skills. So it's kind of broadening out the
additional focus on life skills, but what's actually happened is we're not teaching to think, we're not teaching to learn, we're lowering standards, and you can see it in the test results. It's really important that kids learn their mathematics. It's really important that they know how to spell. These are life skills. These are crucial life skills to set them up to succeed, and the test scores reflect that. So I don't think it is simply an issue of money. It's looking at where this has gone so badly wrong for years now, and we can see where the decline is. And I think it's actually quite obvious that by reducing these standards and frankly expecting less, we are setting these children up to fail in the long term.
So, Angela, Paul's question starts with Scottish schools are no longer top of the class. I mean, Scottish schools were the pride and joy, and rightly so, of Scotland, renowned throughout the world. Standards have declined according to the PISA result. I mean, the graphs are pretty dramatic when you compare to the rest of the UK. This is on your watch. What has gone wrong?
Well, of course, the PISA results are one source of evidence. But
they're an important one. They're an important. Do they not matter?
Well, actually, let me give you a fair and balanced view.
Hang on. Are you saying the PISA results are not fair and balanced? Let's be clear about that.
No, I'm not saying that. But what I am pointing to, and this is factual, that in the Scottish Parliament this week, the Education Secretary responded to the PISA and said, no, it's not good enough that we're average in maths. She also pointed...
Declining.
She also pointed... Well, it's interesting because the other sources of evidence is that the higher maths passes have actually went up in Scotland, and also in terms of curriculum for excellence, that was actually endorsed by the OECD in 2021. But what I was actually going to say, Fiona, is as a parent, what I want for my teenage son is to leave school with an education that prepares him for the world of work and an ever-changing economy, because we know the world around us is ever-changing and that school children today could face up to 14 different job changes.
So then you must be doubly disappointed the results are so bad.
So the benefits of the curriculum is that it improves resilience in an ever-changing world, and it's some of that facts.
It's not working.
Well, that's not what the experts are saying. There is, of course, the PISA results. I'm not for a minute demurring from their importance, but there is a range of other information that shows that the attainment gap between the children from the least and most disadvantaged backgrounds does continue to close in Scotland, that our exam passes this year...
Because they're doing worse. It's closing because they're doing worse. It's nothing to celebrate when you're bringing down the standards, so you're closing the gap. It's only something to celebrate when you're lifting the standards for all children.
I think that is really a slur on the hard work of our school teachers in Scotland, because
it's not a slur. It's about
trust our professional.
You're setting everybody up to fail. The teachers, the children. Do you think that this trajectory is good enough? Fiona put it very well. This used to be a world-renowned pride of joy of Scotland.
When? Name it. When?
What do you mean? What do you mean? Name it. When?
Give us a history lesson. When would we top of the league table for education?
Scotland is world
That's a strange
famous.
Argument, I'm going to say.
To be very clear, you want to know when? Scotland is world famous for its record universities, some of the oldest and best in the world.
It still is.
It was producing.
So are you saying the Scotland schools were not world class then? Is that your argument, Angela?
Top philosophers. You have produced the pupils ready to go into those universities.
What I'm saying, and one of the things that this government has challenged has been the importance of tackling the poverty-related attainment gap, because in Scotland sometimes we look at our past with rose-tinted glasses. So it was this government that took the attainment challenge head on and said that we wanted to address child poverty, also in an attempt to reduce that attainment gap. And your viewers across the UK might also be interested to know that we have the lowest teacher-pupil ratio in Scotland, that we have the highest investment per head of population. Our attainment standards...
None of this is translating to the results. None of this is translating to the results. Do you think they're good enough? Do you think they're good enough?
Well, the Education Secretary this week...
Do you think they're good enough?
The Education Secretary said this week we need to improve attendance at school, behaviour at school and our performance in maths.
So you don't think it's good enough?
So that gives you our answer, that we have identified the things that we want to improve.
Okay. Because we also shouldn't
let our achievements either be talked down. I've given a balanced view that, you know, our children's performance in education...
There's a lot of people shaking their heads here, Angela. I've got to tell you. Meghan, do you want to come in there? You let Angela talk for a long time.
I think Angela's trying to defend the indefensible when it comes to the SNP's track record. But if I may, because the gentleman there made an important point, in early years is really important to me, because not just because I'm a parent of a 17-month-old, but because I've taken a lot of time to speak to nurseries, in particular nursery owners, about the challenges that they face just now, because we do know that the nursery sector is in crisis. We do know that nurseries are closing their doors, you know, across various communities. It's more crucial for rural communities, because if nurseries are taken out of the heart of rural communities, then that is going to have an adverse effect on every single one of you that's in the
we have the best early years child offer on these islands.
I'm going to let other people in, just because I've let you talk for a long time, in fairness.
30 hours.
Well, it's not working. It's not
30
working,
hours
Angela.
a week.
Man there in the check shirt.
And speaking to teachers, one of the things that I'm hearing on a regular basis is that bureaucracy from the Scottish Government is taking up far more time than they are actually teaching in classrooms. And the bureaucracy side and the prescriptive nature of education now is leading to them being disenfranchised, and it's high time that teachers were actually valued and empowered to teach.
Can I check? Have we got any teachers in the audience here? Unusually not. Often we have quite a few. Sorry, put your hands back. Yes, the man in the cap there.
Yes, thanks. The curriculum for excellence is one of those things that sounds brilliant on paper. You can't really argue with it. It just sounds like a fantastic way of bringing children on. But how much actual evidence is of how efficacious it is? Because I know that they introduced it in Sweden, and a similar thing happened with results in that they went down. There's parts of France they've introduced it in, parts of Canada they've introduced it in, and again, the same thing happens, that attainment comes down. So what evidence is there that it actually works, and will there be a review to go forward before it slips any further?
Briefly, because I'm then going to move on.
So there was evidence published this week, evidence that came from teachers, from classroom teachers, based on the professional judgment of classroom teachers, that shows that the performance curriculum level by curriculum level 1 to 4 is improving, and in particular in our primary schools. So there is another important strand of information. I'm only arguing that we take it all in the round, that demonstrates progress within our schools.
Let me take one final question. We've only got about 6 minutes, but I'm going to try and squeeze it in. From Callum Todd. Yes.
Earlier in the week, Keir Starmer said this was the worst cost of living crisis in decades. What would the Labour Party do to reverse this?
Right, so Anna, you've already partly answered this because you've talked about productivity, but people may feel they haven't got years to wait.
No, but it's a really important question, and that's why we, of course, have to have the longer-term plan, but we have to give families immediate support right now.
So how will you do that, and how will you fund it?
So the perfect example is bringing down energy bills. That's why we support the windfall tax on the massive profits that oil and gas companies are making, unexpected profits because of what's happening around the world, and we would use that money to put it directly into people's pockets. That would save the average family around £1,400 a year. That's just one example. And then longer term, how do we bring down people's bills and create jobs at the same time? That is by going hell for leather for clean energy by 2030. That doesn't mean turning off the taps of our oil and gas industry. It means working in partnership with them to get the strategic investments we need to deliver that renewables transition. And a key plank of that will be GB Energy, a publicly owned energy company that each and every single person in this room will have a share in, that'll be headquartered right here in Scotland, creating tens of thousands of jobs. and also bringing down people's bills and bringing down the level of reliance we have on expensive imports, for example, from despotic regimes in Russia. It's one example of many about why we need to get rid of this rotten Tory government and elect a Labour government next year.
Because we haven't got much time, I'm going to have to ask you to be brief. Are you convinced by that, Stephen?
So I think a Labour government, a UK Labour government, is the best possible result of the next election. I think the...
But do you think they can significantly reverse the cost of living crisis?
So if they're constantly dancing to the Tory tune and trying to sort of out-Tory the Tories, I think they may not. So I would encourage Labour to be bolder. And I think one of the ways Labour will be bolder if they are feeling pressure on their left as well, which will come from probably voting Plaid Cymru in Wales and SNP in Scotland.
The challenge is the SNP want another Tory government.
I would
if you want a
encourage...
Labour government, you have to vote for one.
I would encourage Labour to be more Labour. At the moment, Keir Starmer is not being... He's dancing to a Tory tune too often for my liking.
Kate.
It would be wrong to say that there's no money left. There's so much money. We are taxing and spending at record levels, but a lot of people don't feel that because it's being used to plug the gap for short-term issues and issues that the public really want money pushed into, like the National Health Service and pensions, and we're not focused on those long-term capital investments. And I think what we fundamentally need to do to look at growth and to get the economy moving is to tackle housing and planning and to tackle energy infrastructure. Now, Keir Starmer has made really positive noises on housing, but we don't know the plan yet. We also need to look at efficiency gains in the National Health Service. Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, is making positive noises. We need the details. We need to see what that actually looks like, because until we get the details, we can't quite believe it.
So the UK government has already spent £104 billion to tackle the cost of living crisis and to make sure we are getting support to the most vulnerable people in society. But that doesn't mean to say that there isn't more to do, and that's exactly what the UK government has been working on. But I think an interesting point was raised there about the housing crisis, because that is something that we are facing here in Scotland. But again, it's something else that the Scottish Government are just not focused on.
Briefly, Angela.
Well, of course, the nearer Keir Starmer gets to 10 Downing Street, the further away he gets from Labour values. And talking about Wes Streeting, who seems to want to open the doors to the private sector into the NHS, that should be a great worry to us all. And I'd also be interested to hear Labour Party's commitments to deal with the catastrophe of universal credit and whether or not they will actually reverse the two-child rape cap, which, of course, so far they have refused to do.
A brief word.
Well, I just think it's utter nonsense from Angela, and what you're going to hear in the coming months is the SNP ramp up their attacks on Labour because ultimately they want the Tories to win the next general election. You just need to look at the New Deal for working people, the most transformative change to workers' rights in a generation, that's said by both the TUC and the SDUC, that will increase our minimum wage to make it a real living wage, that will end the scandal of fire and rehire, will give people employment rights on day one and get rid of exploitative zero-hour contracts. That's Labour values in action, and you only get it if you get a Labour government.
Let's go back to Jim. Thank you. So, Jim, you voted Conservative at the last election. Yeah. You're now undecided. So come on then. Has anything you've heard informed how you might vote at the next election, which is almost certainly going to be next year?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I mean, the SNP have done good things in Scotland, particularly with renewables. And I do think the Conservatives have done good work as well, but they're just chaotic at this moment in time. And I do like the way Labour are moving more towards the centre. And I think, you know, that's where my heart lies. I think everything should be working more cooperatively, and we should actually find a way of actually managing and delivering and governing this country in a cooperative manner. And I think proportional representation would do that. And I would probably vote for Stephen if he was actually there.
Oh, my goodness. Sadly, not on offer.
But I think he says some really sensible things regarding independence, you know, you can try out making sure it works.
So are you still undecided then?
No, I think I will probably vote Labour, but I know my vote will be wasted.
OK, well, there we are. So, who knows when the next election is going to be? Almost certainly next year. We'll find out. And Jim, good luck with however you choose to vote. Our hour is up. Thank you very much to our panel. Thank you to our audience here in Kelso for coming along. And thank you to you, of course, at home for watching. That's it. until after Christmas. So that's rather exciting for us. And we will be in Oxford, remember, on January the 11th, if you want to come and be part of our audience then. But until then, if it's not too early to say it, Happy Christmas, Happy New Year, and we'll see you on the other side of it. Bye-bye.
From the Rwanda bill to the next general election, more big questions next on BBC One in Newscast.